Hello, everyone, and welcome to this public webinar on the draft global recommendations on nationality and statelessness in the context of climate change. My name is Radha Govill. I'm the Deputy Director at the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness, one of the co-authors of this draft. And I'm joined by my colleague Anne Lacko from UNHCR, who is a Senior Statelessness Officer in the Statelessness section at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. Welcome, everybody. Because this is a webinar, we can't actually see your lovely faces at the moment, but we're assuming that there is a collection of you who've joined, and we're very grateful for you. To you for showing this interest. Just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping because this is a webinar and we are recording it in the hope that we can then put it on the website for those who were not able to join this evening and who may wish to view the webinar. We've disabled your ability to interact with us during the presentation. However, you can use the Q&A function to post your questions, which we will endeavour to respond to as the presentation progresses and a little bit towards the end once we've stopped the recording part of it. The reason we aren't taking questions today is that this is not really the consultation. It's just a presentation and a summary of the work that we've done so far to give you an overview of what these draft recommendations contain. We do, however, very much welcome your input as part of the public consultation process. As you know, we're welcoming comments on any and all aspects of this draft, both the substance but also the structure. And you can do so by going back to the link where you found the link for this webinar. You'll find the instructions there on how to submit your comments and suggestions for improvement. So please do avail of that opportunity. We are really welcoming the views of all who feel that this might be relevant to their work. So we look forward to reading your submissions, which are all due by the 17th of December. So without further ado, we're going to start going through the recommendations. In terms of an overview, we're going to look at a few different points, and it really follows the structure of the document itself. So if you have got the document printed or next to you, you'll be able to sort of follow along and see that we're tracking basically the order in which these elements come up. We're going to start off by talking about why we have developed these global recommendations. We're going to focus a little bit on who the primary and secondary audiences for the recommendations are. A little bit of a note on the scope and structure and why we have structured the global recommendations in this way. We'll then cover a little bit of what the introduction canvasses. It's a fairly long introduction, so we'd like to sort of cover the key points that we raise in it. We've also got a section on guiding principles that are meant to inform the recommendations 1 to 9 before we actually go into the 9 recommendations. We don't have time in this webinar to go through each recommendation in detail, but we will give you a sample recommendation to explain the structure and how we've chosen to convey the information. My colleague, Michelle Yonatani, also from UNHCR, will then join to present on the glossary. And then we'll finish off by looking at the annex, which is attached to the global recommendations to explain what that is. And the final step will be to discuss the process that we've undertaken to date and then the next steps. So without further ado, I will pass over to Anne to take us through the first part of this presentation.
Thank you very much, Radha. So I will start with explaining a little bit of the background and the rationale and the purpose of these recommendations. So the background is, and the rationale is that over the years, as we have at UNHCR and the Peter McMullin Center looked at climate change, statelessness, there are a couple of papers that have been put out previously that kind of touch the issue and look at it relatively superficially. You know, there are a few things that we have been able to say about this before, but we've also realized when we'd like through an extensive literature review as well that there's quite little out there in terms of the nexus between the impacts of climate change and the loss of nationality and statelessness that are very much a reality, but this hasn't really been looked at. And it hasn't been explored and it hasn't been addressed in the international legal and policy responses to the impacts of climate change in particular. So the idea of these recommendations is to fill that gap that there is currently. Um, and as such, the purpose of these recommendations is to guide the states, in particular the states, but also other stakeholders, to take concrete steps that help safeguard everybody's right to a nationality in the context of climate change, and also to reduce the impacts of climate change on those who are already stateless. Um, and the audiences, so the primary audience, as already mentioned in the purpose, is the states, because these are steps that states can take in terms of the laws and policies that they have. So, but obviously in every state there are multiple entities and ministries that are relevant to this, and we have listed some of these in the document. And these include those authorities that are in charge of nationality matters, civil restoration, foreign affairs, environmental issues that include climate change, migration, human rights, and development, health, education, and employment, and those that are responsible for indigenous peoples and minorities. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just to show that there are multiple entities and departments in governments that would have a part to play. So those are the primary audience of these recommendations. But of course, as secondary audiences, there are many others that can support states to take this action to prevent and reduce statelessness and to protect stateless persons in this context. And these would include stateless organizations, civil society groups, researchers, academics, regional and international organizations, including UN agencies. And all of these can support governments in undertaking this assessment and analysis, and then coming up with responses to prevent and to prevent statelessness and protect stateless persons in the context of climate change. Can go to the next one. So a few words about what the scope of these recommendations is, what it covers, and how we've structured it. So the scope and at the same time somehow the structure is linked to UNHCR's 4 pillars of UNHCR statelessness mandate, which is to identify stateless persons, to protect stateless persons, and to prevent and reduce statelessness. So there are all the 9 recommendations, and Rada will go into more detail of the recommendations as such, but they are all listed under one of these pillars. So there are a couple of them under identify, one under protect, several under preventing statelessness, and one under reduction of statelessness. And we thought that that might be helpful because this is how UNHCR normally talks about and organizes the work kind of conceptually around statelessness. The other way that these are structured is around the populations that are affected. And here it says to say briefly that, first of all, affected populations include those who are already stateless, and they might be in their own country, they haven't moved, or they might have had to move across international borders. Then there are also people who currently have a nationality, they're not stateless, but they are at risk of statelessness, or they may become at risk of statelessness, and they might be currently in their country of nationality, or they may have moved across international borders. So those are the 4 categories of affected populations, and the recommendations describe these populations more in detail. But this is also to help governments and others to kind of identify what the population, what the situation, the context that they might be dealing with is, to look at it through the populations that might be affected in their particular context, and through that to see what recommendations are applicable. So several of the recommendations are applicable to many of these groups, to one or more, and this is clearly indicated in the recommendations to which groups of affected persons they apply to. And again, Rada will say a little bit more about how each of the recommendation is structured, but just briefly that each of them provides the context or the problem that needs to be addressed or solved. And then it offers some suggestions for how states and others can implement each of the recommendations. Go to the next one. So, in the introduction of this document, first of all, it sets out the purpose and the audience's scope and the structure that I just briefly described. And apart from that, it provides an overview of the key concepts and terms. And these are both in terms of what we mean by what is nationality and statelessness. So, these concepts are explained, but then also the climate change related concepts and terms, such as the climate related hazards and then human mobility and explanations of what is meant by the phrase in the context of climate change. So as you would have seen that the title is Nationality and Statelessness in the context of climate change. So what exactly is meant by this is detailed in the introduction of the document. The introduction also provides an overview of the international legal frameworks governing the right to nationality and statelessness, as well as in relation to climate change. And just to say, in terms of the rationality and statelessness in particular, of course, there are many other documents that UNHCR and others have put out. So this does not attempt to explain all of it, but it tries to, as much as possible, to make reference to other relevant documents. And here we just talk about it specifically in the context of climate change. An important part of the introduction is the description of the debates around risk of statelessness that have been raised in relation to projected impacts of sea level rise and the habitability and loss of physical territory, and that the implications that this might have on statehood. And it is explained that there is a growing support by states and others for the continuity of statehood to address this risk that would come from the sea level rise and loss of habitable physical territory, and how this is not necessarily the major issue when we talk about statelessness in the context of climate change. But this is all explained there in the introduction. And again, also the introduction explains more in detail those different categories of affected populations that I just explained in the previous slide. And then right after the introduction, the document sets out some guiding principles that underpin these recommendations. So these are something that are then not explained extensively in the context of each recommendation, but these are something that need to be considered when looking at each of these recommendations. So these are 5 guiding principles that are based on universally applicable international legal norms. The first one of them is importantly the right to nationality, which is a fundamental human right. And it basically means that everybody is entitled to a nationality and no one should be arbitrarily deprived of or denied a nationality. And as the right to nationality and having a nationality is often what enables an access and enjoyment of other human rights. This is particularly important in the context of the climate change as well, that anybody affected by climate change should be able to enjoy a nationality and through that, the other basic human rights. The second principle is the principle of equality and non-discrimination, which means that everybody should be treated equally and no one should face discrimination based on their race, gender, disability, or other protected attributes. And that this also means that this is also important in terms of statelessness and climate change, in particular because discrimination is such a important underlying cause of statelessness, and it is also often a consequence of statelessness. So this principle of non-discrimination is really double important in the context of climate change, as people might have multiple vulnerabilities, the first one being that they might not have a nationality. The third principle underpinning the recommendations is the right to life with dignity, meaning that individuals should not arbitrarily or unlawfully be deprived of life, and they should be able to live in a manner that respects their inherent worth and value. And it means that they should be able to access basic necessities and be free from discrimination. And this is important also because of the severe impacts of statelessness that statelessness often has on basic rights. Which then in the context of climate change, again, there are even more risks to this basic right of life with dignity. The fourth one is the duty of international cooperation. Um, and this is something that obliges states to work together and achieve common goals and to solve shared problems. And this extends to human rights and international and environmental concerns. And this is particularly important in the context of climate change, also when climate change impacts are causing people to move across international borders. So there then has to be international cooperation around these issues because the impacts of climate change are also not contained within borders of one country. Finally, but importantly, the principle of right to participate. And this has to do both with the rights of the states impacted to participate in law and policy decisions that have implications on them, but also the right of people to participate in processes that involve them or that have impacts on them. And this is, of course, also then in the context of climate change that people should have the right to participate meaningfully in these processes, and in particular also those who are stateless and who are often left out in many of the processes and services. So it's important to emphasize that those affected or likely to be affected need to be involved in these discussions and in these processes. I think that's all I had on this one. So over to you, Rada.
Thanks very much, Annie. So I'm going to now dive into the recommendations themselves. As I said, I'm not going to detail each of the recommendations. You'll need to go to the document to do that. But I would like to sort of give you the overview and then explain one of them in perhaps a bit more detail to give you a flavor of how we've developed it. So we have 9 recommendations in total, and as you'll recall from the earlier slide, they're structured around the 4 pillars of UNHCR's statelessness mandate. There's not an even number of recommendations under each of those pillars. The number varies. But essentially we work through the 4 pillars being identify, protect, prevent, and reduce, and look at this through the prism of climate change. And what we've tried to do here is be as comprehensive as possible in thinking about the specific risks that climate change bring to those who are already stateless or those who might end up stateless. So we really try to think beyond the risks that normally exist for those who are stateless and those who might be at risk. What is it? What is the added factor of the climate change impacts or the climate-related hazards that makes it important to create recommendations that are addressing these issues specifically? So to begin with, recommendations 1 and 2, which fall under the identify pillar. The first one, recommendation 1, is really focused around the need to identify and enumerate stateless people and also those without a recognized nationality status. And this is important not only in national counting exercises, because these are often used to inform development and humanitarian policies, but also the kinds of national surveys that might be taking place on a more geographical or localized basis to really kind of develop the necessary plans for climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. And our thinking around this particular recommendation actually drew quite a lot from the experience that stateless people had in the context of the COVID pandemic, where because of a lack of understanding of who was stateless and where they were located, all those kinds of emergency plans that were put in place for COVID frequently left stateless people out, which was obviously not only hugely problematic for the populations who were stateless themselves, but also for the wider population, given the vicious spread of COVID. And so likewise, we think that it's really critical that we use this opportunity to ensure that stateless people are properly identified and enumerated where possible, knowing that those kinds of numbers are currently available in very, very few countries. The second recommendation really focuses on those who've been displaced or that have migrated across international borders and the need for them to be formally recognised through the establishment and implementation of what we call a statelessness determination procedure, a dedicated procedure to actually asking the right questions to work out whether or not a person is stateless, because without such a procedure, it's very hard to determine that a person has the specific needs that a stateless person might have. And critically, for those countries that are party to the 1954 Convention, it makes it very difficult for those states to actually implement their obligations if they don't know who they have those obligations towards. And this recommendation has been identified as important because it's projected that there will be increased displacement and migration in the context of climate change, given the kinds of climate-related hazards that are forecast. And this displacement and migration will not just be internal, it is also likely to be cross-border, which is why it's really important that there is an expansion in the number of countries that might be receiving stateless people, that they have these procedures in place. To date, only about 30 countries around the world have these procedures, and in a number of those countries, they're not even particularly operational. So that's why we've identified this as an important recommendation. Recommendation 2 is really focused around the need to protect the rights of stateless persons, so moving to that second pillar of UNHCR's mandate. And here we recognise that, as it is, stateless people tend to be marginalised and tend to be the most vulnerable in society. Because of their lack of nationality, they are unable to, in normal circumstances, access the full range of rights. With the added impact of climate change, it's expected that that susceptibility and vulnerability will grow. So it's all the more important that stateless people, there's a focus on them, particularly to understand that their rights need to be protected. Moving then on to the third pillar, which is the prevention of nationality. This is where we see the largest grouping of our 9 recommendations. And we really work through the different population groups here as well. We start with a fairly broad recommendation that focuses on the need to prevent loss of nationality and statelessness in the context of climate change by sitting back and actually assessing the legal and policy frameworks that exist in different countries to identify exactly where those potential risks of loss of nationality and statelessness might arise. For those who are interested, there's sort of one fairly comprehensive report that has been written so far called The Future of Nationality in the Pacific, co-authored by the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness and the Caldor Centre, which really looks at those kinds of risks that this recommendation is getting at, that exist in the policy and legal frameworks of countries in the Pacific. Obviously, a bit of a hotspot when it comes to climate impacts, and through that kind of granular assessment of those laws and policies of those countries, that report has been able to pinpoint those pressure points in law and policy where when those laws and policies interact with the impacts of climate change, you could see an increased risk of statelessness. And we think that it's really important that there's actually that level of assessment done for all countries around the world, but particularly those that might be in those climate change hotspots. Recommendation 5 focuses on preventing loss of nationality, excuse me, or voluntary renunciation of nationality that could lead to statelessness, particularly for those who are displaced or who migrate across international borders. Again, this recommendation comes in because of the projected increase in such displacement and migration, but also recognizing that many nationality laws around the world still maintain provisions that allow a person to lose their nationality if, for example, they choose to reside permanently outside their own country or their country of nationality. There's no safeguard there to prevent statelessness in that context. Likewise, a number of countries do allow individuals to renounce their nationality even before they've acquired another nationality. So you can envisage a situation here where people might, at least temporarily, be left stateless if, for example, they wish to acquire the nationality of the country to which they're moving, but in order to do so, they have to renounce their first nationality. And so this recommendation is really designed to close those loopholes and gaps that could leave people stateless in the context of climate change. The sixth recommendation is really focused on children and the need to prevent childhood statelessness by ensuring that all children are able to acquire a nationality in the context of climate change. And what we're thinking about specifically here are circumstances where displacement, be that internal or cross-border, occurs. And unfortunately, children are separated from or lose their parents, particularly in the context of climate-related hazards or acute disasters. And in that case, it could be that they're left as foundlings, so abandoned, and the identity of the parents is not known. In those cases, it's really important that states have the necessary safeguards in their nationality laws to ensure that these children actually acquire the nationality of the state in which they're found. Likewise, you can envisage a situation where there is cross-border displacement. The parents either unable to prove their nationality or in fact are stateless. And children born to such parents need to be assured of the right to a nationality, regardless of their parents' status. And in this context, it's really important that countries have those kinds of safeguards that allow children who would otherwise be left stateless to acquire their nationality to ensure that childhood statelessness does not ensue. The seventh recommendation really focuses on the importance of documentation, and one can easily envisage where you've got particularly rapid onset disasters, and where you've got systems which are largely paper-based, key documents that could help to prove nationality or an entitlement to nationality, such as birth certificates or the destruction of civil registries, or key pieces of identity, including proof of nationality, could jeopardize a person's claim to that nationality and eventually leave them stateless. So this recommendation is really focused on the importance of digitizing and digitalizing records and systems to ensure that we're not relying on paper-based documents that are vulnerable in a climate change context. And then the last recommendation under the prevention pillar is recommendation 8, which is around the prevention of loss of nationality and statelessness in the context of bilateral and multilateral agreements that have been designed to facilitate cross-border migration. And I'll talk a little bit about this one in particular next in some more detail. And then finally, recommendation 9, which is under the fourth and final pillar of UNHCR statelessness mandate, the need to reduce and in fact resolve statelessness by expediting the resolution of all known cases of statelessness. And this is particularly in light of the fact that we understand that there are going to be compounding effects of statelessness, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of climate change. Stateless people are going to be amongst the most vulnerable in this context. So if that kind of layer of vulnerability, the lack of nationality can be removed, they stand a greater chance of being able to be resilient and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Being stateless makes it that much harder. And the fact remains that some of the largest populations of known populations of statelessness around the world are sort of coinciding with those climate change hotspots as we know them, and that are projected to occur into the future. So, a bit of a deep dive into recommendation 8. I said that I'd sort of talk about one of the recommendations in a bit more detail, just so you can understand how we've structured it. So just to recap, recommendation 8 is really focused on bilateral and multilateral agreements that are being developed to facilitate cross-border migration from one state to another in the context of climate change. And to date, we've really only seen one of these emerge, and that's the Australia-Tuvalu-Fali-Pali Treaty, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which sort of sets out the key elements of an agreement whereby members, nationals of Tuvalu can migrate permanently to Australia. And this has been designed in acknowledgement of the fact that climate change poses an existential threat to the country of Tuvalu. And Australia in particular is negotiating these kinds of agreements with a number of its Pacific partners, but it's expected that this kind of arrangement might become more popular as time moves on. And what we've noticed so far is that in the discussions around these kinds of agreements, there is a lot of focus on the actual movement of people, but less so about what happens to their nationality. And this is why this particular recommendation is relevant for those who are actual nationals of a state who are going to move to another country, but are at risk of losing their nationality and being left stateless once they have moved to the new country. And this could be for a range of reasons because of conflicts between the laws of the two countries, because the country that they're moving to does not have those adequate safeguards, because their country of nationality permits them to lose their nationality before they've acquired a new one, so on and so forth. And so we feel that the context in which this recommendation has been developed is that it's really important through this recommendation that states that are considering entering into these bilateral or multilateral agreements, be they a sort of so-called sending state or a receiving state, both do an assessment, a proper assessment of the impact of on nationality of such migration that might occur under such agreements, but also that the agreements themselves must explicitly address these issues of nationality in order to avoid risks of statelessness. For example, the Australia-Tuvalu Pali Treaty does not detail what happens to a person from Tuvalu and their nationality when they move to Australia. That detail has been left to a sort of explanatory memorandum that doesn't have binding legal force. And it's such a fundamental issue on a number of levels that we think that it's really critical that this kind of issue is addressed directly in these kinds of permanent migration arrangements. Each recommendation then sets out a number of implementation points, and these are not comprehensive because we don't have a crystal ball and we can't identify every step that could be taken, but we've tried to identify some really practical things that states, with the assistance of others, could do to ensure that the recommendation is implemented as well as possible. So for this particular recommendation, and this is not an exhaustive list of what we've included, but for example, we've said that it's really important that the populations, particularly the affected populations that would be subject to these agreements, are meaningfully involved and therefore have that right to participate in the discussions around the design, negotiation, and implementation of such agreements. It's really important that states ensure that the agreements directly address the potential impacts of migration on the nationality status of their nationals. So, for example, do they explicitly address issues around whether it's possible to retain and confer nationality of the country of origin? And really importantly, do these agreements permit dual or multiple nationality? Because allowing dual or multiple nationality would sort of act as a safeguard against statelessness, that even if one nationality is lost, another will sort of remain. So these are just a small sample of the kinds of implementation points that are fleshed out in more detail in the recommendations themselves. So moving on to sort of the final part of the recommendations, which are the glossary and the annex, I'd now like to pass over to my colleague Michelle Yonitani from UNHCR, who's going to talk a little bit about how we've compiled the glossary.
So yes, so as this document is, all these recommendations are bringing together different fields of expertise, the glossary is rather important to guide the reader through. And so the list provided in the glossary gives key terms and concepts used in the document, each of which are hyperlinked and highlighted for the first time that they're used in the document. Maybe just to quickly highlight, so we've brought together some of the key terms related to statelessness itself, the state of the art, if you like, but also brought in key terms from the climate change area, including, for example, on loss and damage, adaptation, extreme weather events, slow onset events. Also from the state-of-the-art terms from the disaster risk reduction field around hazards, exposure, vulnerability, disaster. And because of its strong linkage, terms also related to human mobility, here using the human mobility term as it's also being used in the climate change context. So terms including migration, displacement, and planned relocation. And as part of the view, your feedback on the helpfulness of the glossary, or if you think there would be other things that are not there or in the document that would be helpful to spell out further, would be very welcome. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I'll start again. So the final part of the document is the annex, which has really been designed as a complement to recommendation 4 of the document. And recommendation 4, as you might recall, relates to the need for states to do an assessment to identify where in their laws and policies those risks of statelessness or loss of nationality might arise in the context of climate change. So what we've done in the annex is really put together a list of 19 very direct key questions that will help states to identify where these risks might lie. The questions in the checklist are grouped under some key headings, and you can see those on the screen. But when you go into the annex and you look at the specific questions that are asked, those questions are also cross-referenced against each of the 9 recommendations as relevant. So a state will be able to use this annex to sort of answer a question. If the answer is a positive answer, yes, I do have this problem in my nationality law, they'll then be able to look at the cross-reference to the relevant recommendation that would then be applicable to them to read and implement. So with that, that concludes our sort of run through the draft global recommendations on climate change, on nationality and statelessness in the context of climate change. We will be posting this presentation online so that you will have a chance to review it or share the link with others who weren't able to join or who might be interested to have a summary overview. And we very much welcome, as I mentioned before, your submissions on any and all aspects of this document. And that really takes me to the final slide, which is on what our sort of next steps are. The public comment period has been open since the 17th of November through to the 15th of December. Apologies, I think earlier on I might have said the 17th of December. I was just mixing my 2 dates up, but it will conclude on the 15th of December. And we will apply that deadline fairly strictly because we do have a number of steps that we then need to take to finalize the document. We then plan to review and incorporate all relevant public comments in the first quarter of 2026 with a view to finalizing and publishing the global recommendations online in the second quarter of 2026. We're currently looking at hopefully being able to have a formal launch of the document. We're looking at a couple of physical avenues where we can do this, and that will most likely take place towards the end of the second quarter, but most likely in the third quarter of 2026. And after that, we do plan a series of activities to hopefully disseminate these global recommendations and ideally have opportunities to talk about them, workshop them, and support states to implement them.